Why did Vladimir Putin, who saved Bashar al-Assad's regime in 2015, distance himself from Syria in 2024? Discover the behind-the-scenes of this complex relationship now. The relationship between Russia and Syria is one of the most intriguing in modern geopolitics, filled with history, strategy, and decisive moments that have shaped the Middle East. From the Cold War era, when the Soviet Union provided military and political support to Syria, to the dramatic intervention of Vladimir Putin in 2015, which saved Bashar al-Assad's regime during the civil war, this alliance has been a pillar for both nations. But in 2024, this historic partnership faced new challenges. The war in Ukraine drained Russia's military and economic resources, while Assad's inability to rebuild a self-sufficient military force culminated in his resignation. Over the decades, the Russian naval base in Tartus and the air base in Mymimim became symbols of Moscow's power in the region, ensuring strategic presence in the Mediterranean. However, the fragility of the Syrian regime, the strengthening of regional adversaries such as Turkey and Iran, and the pressures from local insurgencies have put Russia at a crossroads. Continue supporting an ally that no longer provides the same strategic benefits, or focus on preserving its own geopolitical interests without further compromising its resources? To understand the current situation between Russia and Syria, it's essential to revisit their historical roots. After World War II, the Middle East became a strategic chessboard during the Cold War, with the Soviet Union seeking allies to counterbalance Western influence. Syria, with its opposition to colonialism and Israeli expansionism, aligned itself with the Soviet Union in the 1950s, sealing a political and military partnership. This alliance strengthened in 1971 when Syria allowed the installation of the Soviet naval base in Tartus, providing the Soviet Union with a strategic point in the Mediterranean. Thousands of Syrians were trained in the Soviet Union, consolidating cultural ties and creating an elite influence by Soviet values. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia maintained its strategic presence in Syria. When Bashar al-Assad took power in 2000, the relationship was renewed, culminating in Russia's military intervention in 2015 to save his regime. This intervention was motivated not only by the protection of Russian bases, but also by Putin's desire to reaffirm Russia's global influence and combat extremist terrorism that threatened to spread to Russian territory. This history is not just about diplomatic ties, but also about strategic interests spanning decades, making the Russia-Syria alliance one of the most complex and enduring in the international landscape. In 2015, Vladimir Putin took the decisive step of intervening militarily in Syria, a move that marked a turning point in Middle Eastern geopolitics. Several strategic reasons influenced this decision. First, the military bases in Tartus and Mymimim were crucial for Russia's projection of power in the Mediterranean, and without them, Moscow would lose a vital geopolitical presence in the region. The intervention was also driven by the fear of a possible emergence of a new Muammar Gaddafi, as the Syrian regime was on the brink of collapse, and Putin feared Assad might be overthrown in a manner similar to the Libyan dictator. Moreover, there was an increasing risk of jihadist fighters returning to Russia, threatening the country's internal stability. For Putin, it was more strategic to confront these threats in Syria, where military involvement would be more effective than allowing these groups to expand. Another crucial factor was the demonstration of strength on the global stage. The intervention allowed Russia not only to protect its strategic interests in Syria, but also to reinforce its image as a global power capable of challenging Western supremacy, especially in the Middle East. With the Russian Air Force conducting intensive bombings, Assad's regime achieved significant victories, such as recapturing the city of Aleppo in 2016, which was one of the highlights of the Russian intervention. Russia's military presence in Syria was essential for maintaining control over key areas and ensuring that Assad stayed in power, unlike other regimes from the Arab Spring that fell under Western pressure. The intervention also proved crucial in reaffirming Russia's position as a strategic power in the region, maintaining its influence in the Middle East through its alliance with Assad. The relationship between Russia and Syria began to show signs of strain, especially after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The war in Ukraine required a massive mobilization of Russian military and economic resources, compromising Putin's ability to sustain the intervention in Syria. The Russian armed forces were overwhelmed, and Moscow's priorities shifted, with more attention focused on the Eastern European front. Moreover, despite all the Russian military support over the years, Syria still had not managed to build a self-sufficient and effective army, leaving Assad's regime vulnerable to new insurgencies. The lack of military reforms in Syria, coupled with the strengthening of regional powers like Turkey, which supports rebel groups in the north, made the situation more complex. Iran, another key ally of Assad, was also facing difficulties due to international sanctions and the weakening of its regional position, making it harder for Damascus to rely solely on Tehran. Faced with these challenges, Putin seems to have adjusted his strategy, prioritizing the protection of Russian bases in Tartus and Mymim, while pressuring Assad to seek a diplomatic solution with regional powers such as Turkey. This shift in focus from Putin reflects a pragmatic analysis of Russia's limited resources. With the demands of the war in Ukraine and internal challenges, Russia now appeared more inclined to secure control over crucial strategic assets without spending further resources on an alliance that was not delivering the expected results. However, the year 2024 marked a historic turning point in this relationship. Under intense internal and external pressure, Bashar al-Assad resigned from office and left Syria, in a move that shocked the international community. Reports indicate that Russia played a crucial behind-the-scenes role in this decision, withdrawing part of its political and military support for the regime after years of frustration with Damascus' inability to rebuild its political and military strength. Assad's resignation was also the result of Moscow's shift in priorities. With the war in Ukraine consuming a large portion of Russia's resources and the strain on the domestic economy, Putin seemed increasingly less inclined to sustain a regime that, in his view, was no longer capable of serving Russia's strategic interests in the region. Furthermore, the strengthening of Turkey's presence in northern Syria and the growing challenges posed by other regional powers forced the Kremlin to adopt a more pragmatic approach. The focus shifted to preserving Russia's military bases in Tartus and Mymim, which remain essential strategic points for Russia's power projection in the Mediterranean. Assad's fall was accelerated by an offensive from a coalition of rebel groups who took key cities like Aleppo with surprising ease. The insurgency received logistical support from Turkey, increasing pressure on the regime, which was already weakened by years of conflict and economic isolation. At the same time, Israel and Hezbollah entered into a ceasefire, limiting Assad's options for mobilizing military support during the critical moment. Assad's departure opened the door to an uncertain future for Syria. Without its main leader and with a fragmented support base, the country faces the challenge of dealing with new insurgencies and territorial disputes. The absence of a clear successor and the fragmentation of forces loyal to the regime created a power vacuum that local groups and regional powers quickly began to contest. Meanwhile, Russia is trying to preserve its influence on the Syrian chessboard through negotiations with Turkey and Iran, seeking to maintain its strategic military presence in the Mediterranean and safeguard its regional interests without investing additional resources in an increasingly unfavorable conflict. The fall of Bashar al-Assad marks the end of an era in Syria and reflects the chronic instability of the Middle East, where alliances and power balances are constantly in flux. We're finishing here. However, by clicking on the video that appears on your screen, you'll have access to content just as good as this one. See you soon!